Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for this opening panel. Really good to have you with us. Now, when you talk about digital infrastructure, it's becoming increasingly important. It's a key enabler of growth. Statistics show that a 10 percentage point increase in internet penetration rate will lead to a 2.8 percentage point rise in GDP. It's also crucial for financial inclusion. It creates opportunities, entrepreneurship, especially for those typically left behind, like women. If you take Indonesia as an example, a vast archipelago with 17,000 islands, 60% of the SMEs there are founded and owned by women, partly, largely, because of better connectivity. Now, the issue with most things is funding, and that gap is estimated to reach $1 trillion in 2040. The question really is, how do you bridge that gap? What role can the MDBs play? And how do you engage all the stakeholders? So I'm very privileged to introduce to you a very high-level panel today. We have His Excellency, Mr. Mark Hansen, Luxembourg Minister Delegate for Digitalization. Thank you very much for joining us. His Excellency, Mr. Ibrahim Amir, Maldives Minister for Finance and AIIB Governor for Maldives. Sir Douglas Flint, Chairman, Standard Life Aberdeen. Mr. Paul Barrowman, Group Chief Technology Officer, PCCW-HKT, to my extreme left. Mr. Peter Durand, Managing Director, Macquarie Infrastructure Asset Group. And Mr. Joachim von Amsberg, that's Doctor, Vice President of AIIB. Now, Minister Hansen, perhaps we can start with you. When you take a look at MDBs, typically only 1% of all investments that go into infrastructure actually goes to digital infrastructure. Why has it been so low?
So, first of all, if you allow, because I'm the member of the Luxembourgish government, if you allow, I want to warmly welcome everyone here in Luxembourg. It's a great honor to be here, and I saw this morning in my office the opening session, and I was asking myself, in times of a panel discussing about digital connectivity, why are we here today in Luxembourg? More than 1,500 people. Everyone could have been also in his office and seeing this panel or the discussions, but I'm happy to have you here, because digital connectivity and digital world is also about seeing each other, about trust, about discussing each with the other, and to have this collaboration, and that the human beings see each other to discuss. It's just as an introduction to have you here in Luxembourg, and to thank you for your presence. I think one word now coming to your answer, it is very important. Infrastructures are really cost intensive. I think that is one of the main topics, and the principal constraint is that they are seen as being a mean, respectively support the other final activities coming afterwards. So in this sense, services or activities linked to these infrastructures are those which people are willing to pay for, and not the infrastructure itself. And I think that makes investments in infrastructures less appealing for investments, and it's there where we all, in our collaborations, should play a key role.
Joachim, maybe your take from the AIIB perspective.
Yes, we see that very little investment from the multilateral banks has gone into digital infrastructure. And we're asking ourselves, should AIIB handle this differently? And we put this topic on the agenda because we want your input, asking you, should we position ourselves differently? Our hypothesis is, yes, we should handle this differently. For a new MDB, digital connectivity could actually be a central part of our investment strategy. And let me give you a few reasons. You've already talked about the growth impact. I think the role of digital infrastructure for inclusion is incredibly important. You mentioned the women entrepreneurs in Indonesia, but there are many other examples of access to finance, access to health and education services that are enabled by digital infrastructure, and I think the very strong public policy case for ensuring investment in those areas. But interestingly, as digital infrastructure as a sector matures, I think we realize that digital infrastructure does have some similarities with traditional infrastructure. There are similar challenges of regulation, of access, barriers to entry, of universal service requirements that could be put in place, of safety standards. The equivalent of road safety standards could be data privacy and internet security standards, all aspects where public policy interacts very closely with the investment. That maybe is also the reason why private investment, while there's of course flowing, but leaves still a big gap there in digital infrastructure, which means that actually public banks or banks with a public policy mandates like the multilaterals could actually play an important role. And I think we're very keen to explore that role, discuss with you, what do you see us play in this space? What's the missing piece that a multilateral can play that is willing to invest a lot more than 1% of its resources in this very critical digital infrastructure sector?
Paul, Peter, given that you're both in the tech space, I'm wondering, is there a lack of appreciation for what digital infrastructure actually brings to a country?
Well, I think it's very well known now, and you mentioned the statistics, that the growth in internet penetration does actually increase GDP. And there should be more being spent on this infrastructure than what governments are spending. But I think that to a large extent, since competition was introduced into networks, it's been largely left up to the private sector to build these networks. I think things are going to change, because I think we're getting to a stage now where basic internet access isn't enough, that websites have become so sophisticated with video and pictures that the basic access has got to be at least something like 2 megabits per second or something. Some of the older technologies that we have to choose from, and we as technologists have a lot of different choices, from satellite all the way down to copper-based solutions, and including fiber and wireless. But different technologies have different places in different markets or different geographies. So I think we have to be careful what we choose, but we are moving forward, and I think there's a particular moment in time coming when we can do something really, really big with this.
So we should look at digital infrastructure as contributing to more than just that 2.8 percentage point increase in GDP, correct?
Oh, absolutely. I think what's coming in now with massive hyper-connectivity and the connectivity that we can bring to healthcare and to connected cars, reducing accidents, there's so many things we can work on now because of that hyper-connectivity. Mind you, that's not forgetting about the rural areas and the developing countries where basic connectivity has to be improved. But I think in the urban areas of the developed countries, we're looking at hyper-connectivity and what we can do with all of those devices.
Peter?
Sure. Well, a few things I would say, in addition to certainly just inverted commas, the GDP impact. As an asset owner already, I mean, we're looking at digitization first as a customer's point of view. We have many assets that are going to benefit hugely on operational efficiency, commercial efficiency, health and safety, and the use for the consumers that use these bits of infrastructure from digitalization, right? So first and foremost, we see that as a customer. Clearly, it's an area to invest in terms of the underlying infrastructure, which we're doing a lot. So we own quite a few, or invest in quite a few telecom companies around the world, and networks that are expanding what that coverage is, going from copper to fiber, et cetera. And then also thinking about rural connectivity isn't necessarily even just an emerging market issue. Certainly it's an issue in many developed countries around the world, whether it's agricultural and rail assets we have in remote Australia, which are very hard to get connected, all the way through, in the UK where I live, it's still an issue of not having broadband access in the countryside. But certainly in emerging markets, it's just that much more profound.
I'll pick on that topic slightly later, that point, but Minister Ibrahim, I mean, from your perspective, when you take a look at digital infrastructure and technology as a whole, how do you see that changing and helping the Maldives?
Thank you very much. The Maldives is, as you just mentioned about the Indonesian perspective, we are also a vast archipelago with many islands, around 1,200 islands. And I would like to say that Maldives should be one of the most connected countries in the world for a small, medium country. We have around a number of mobile subscribers is around 842,000, while our population number is around 365,000. You have actually asked a question, why is the investment in digital infrastructure so low in countries? But you have asked the opinion from the experts. But I would like to say that the investment on infrastructure is so low because we, as countries, we tend to focus more on other basic infrastructures. Like the Maldives, when you talk about prioritizing investments, as a finance minister, I would like to invest in the basic infrastructures like water and sanitation, like the health facilities, like building harbors, road development, and also other things. As you know, Maldives is also a country with diverse effects on climate change. Because of climate change, we also invest heavily on climate adaptation. So I think the sequencing and the prioritizing of investment is the most important factor. When you ask me what is the first thing that you want to invest in, the basic infrastructures is the most important thing. But I would like to say that for a small, medium country, Maldives is one of the most connected country in the world. We are working on a payment system whereby internet instant payments can be realized, and our tax GST and GST can also be realized instantly when you pay when you go to a shop. And so I think prioritizing investment is the first thing.
Yeah, perhaps in illustrating also what infrastructures can bring to a country, I can perhaps talk a little bit also about Luxembourg. In the year 2000, we started here in Luxembourg with a diversification strategy, and we created really heavy invest in infrastructure. So we have now data centers from tier 1 to tier 4 certifications, low latency compatibility with connectivity to other countries, direct international connections, and we have now 46,000 square meters of data centers here in Luxembourg, being in fact one of the countries with the largest per capita data center square meters of really, and it made of us, we had now a new IT ecosystem actually ready for having and to see the benefit of these infrastructure. If we talk afterwards about perhaps Europe lagging in the world, we see also in the different benchmark reports now Luxembourg is heading, and we are really getting a data hub, and we are creating new sectors and attract other people and other countries to also come to Luxembourg to invest. We have in our data centers the first data embassy, for instance. So, and other countries, it's Estonia who have a data embassy in Luxembourg. Other countries are interested. You see, this started 15, 20 years ago with heavy infrastructure invest, and it brings to Luxembourg really a new ecosystem, and we are seen in different benchmark reports, we are seen as a front runner in this context, and I think that is also important, illustrating also perhaps for other countries which way they can choose and where the investments should go to continue in this way.
Paul, before I get to you, I just want to get Sir Douglas into the conversation. He's happy seated there, just observing. We heard from Minister Ibrahim about how, you know, for developing countries, the priority is always the basic infrastructure. But as Peter mentioned earlier, I mean, even Europe, developed nations are kind of lagging when it comes to investment in digital infrastructure. What's their excuse?
There are many excuses, one of which is regulation. I remember being somewhat surprised and probably appalled being in a meeting where the CEO of one of our largest mobile phone operators was saying that the single market of Europe was a fascinating concept, but why did he have 50 regulators in 28 countries? And I think that one of the challenges in Europe has been the fact that what is the size of the market, and you know, when you reflect on digital, it's a boundaryless concept in reality, and yet it's compartmentalized into countries that have to think about privacy of data, the tax base, the impact on the traditional industries, and basically what their entire policy framework is for interoperability and data sharing. So in a kind of a way, the industry's grown up far faster than the policy framework that would support it. I think there's also, I mean, I think the conversation so far has been largely around telecommunications, which is hugely the backbone of the digital economy and the enabler. But I would argue that the digital economy today is much, much broader. Even the basic infrastructure of bridges and roads and airports and container terminals and nothing is built today without collecting data. And the digital economy is all about how much data have you got and how can you manipulate it, use it, understand it, gain insights from it, which gets you into AI and machine learning and gets you into all the sort of concepts about whose rights to data and so on is. But, you know, the heavy infrastructure from satellites to cables to the data collection capacity of bridges, roads, all the systems that are being built, I think is a much, much bigger ecosystem and a lot more being in reality in the digital economy than just the telecommunication aspect. But the key issue for me is that the policy framework is still national, and yet we're in a globalized world, and the challenges are because of rights, privacy, protection, which are all legitimate political concerns in a world where the companies belong kind of nowhere.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're getting to the nub of what this seminar is about here. With everything that Sir Douglas has said, I think there's still this fact that the underlying connectivity fabric for all that data is still telecommunications, and it's still missing in many places, even in the built-up urban areas. And to the Minister from Maldives' point about focus on the telecoms infrastructure because there's other things, I can give you a very good example of why it is that I think perhaps the AIIB can help to try and change the perception of governments about this. In Hong Kong, right, we have lots of fiber to 87% of buildings. Every street has fiber in it. Every street has people digging up the roads, whether it's for gas, for water, for electricity. They're digging up the roads, and every week a cable gets cut. And we will lose 10,000 customers because of that cable being cut. If those contractors dig up a gas pipe or a water pipe, it is a criminal offense. But for telecoms infrastructure, it's not. This is how little the government places on what has to be a new, it is a utility now, absolutely, and we need to change that perception. The same when it comes to spectrum and other things, how they approach providing spectrum to build these networks in future.
I know we're talking about digital infrastructure, and Minister Ibrahim was talking about, you know, meeting the needs of the basic infrastructure first. Is there a way that digital infrastructure can help developing economies leapfrog? What's your take on that? Peter, perhaps?
Well, sure. I mean, obviously, the example everyone will always give is mobile telephone jumping over landlines, right? And we see similar discussions happening in the energy space. Can renewables and distributed energy do the same in conventional infrastructure, and et cetera? It's always a debate. But I would say that the development really should go hand in hand. And I completely take the minister's point. If you can't get somewhere, if you don't have clean water, et cetera, this is going to be a focus for government. But I do think it's important to think about what can digital do to help enable that core infrastructure in the first instance. And Sir Douglas's point, anymore when you design something, you're designing it in a digital environment in the first place. One of the things that we're looking at is continuing, how can you go from that design to the operations of new assets in a fully digital environment, digital twins, whatever you want to call them, but also even looking at brownfield sites or existing assets. How can you work towards digitizing those things that already exist to make their operations better? So I would not, as I said, don't just look at the GDP impact in and of itself, but also think about its ability to improve the infrastructure that you're building, that conventional core infra.
And think about the extraordinary financial inclusion enabling that's been done by digital infrastructure in places like Kenya with M-Pesa. Think of India digitalizing the entire population in order to get benefit payments to the lowest paid in the country without the sort of intermediation of people clipping a bit off as it goes. Think of the fact that China's moved through all the stages of payment processing to simply it's now it's an app. I mean, payments is nothing, not in the banking system. It's an app, and it's now through facial recognition, and merchants can get a readout of their customers' creditworthy instantly, and it, you know, it's taken the whole marketing concept and payment concept and credit concept to a different level. And yet in the US, which in many ways is the most sophisticated technology market in the world, people still write checks. I mean, it is extraordinary how utilization has changed in Asia, I think, in the payments business far, far faster than anywhere else. And that is contributing hugely to GDP growth and inclusion and enabling the lowest paid within society and the smallest businesses to have a much lower cost proposition.
Earlier, Paul mentioned about how, I think was it Paul or was it Sir Douglas who mentioned about how regulators are way behind the curve when it comes to technological advancement. I mean, how do they play catch up, and how do we change that? What policies need to be in place? Is it a matter of changing the mindset?
Yes, I mean,
agreed.
It's localization, isn't it? I mean, as a government, the responsibility to keep your citizens safe from harm is paramount, or is a key responsibility. And some governments, many governments, see their citizens' data being held in a different country under different legal protections as a problem. And kind of, if you were starting with a blank sheet of paper, you would kind of build a supranational utility. Maybe this is somewhere where the MDBs can really contribute. You'd build something that was not under the jurisdiction of any one country, but under the jurisdiction of a collective of nations that put security and privacy to an international standard and were regulated by an international body rather than by any country. I mean, the only analogy I can think of is sort of a nuclear non-proliferation kind of framework. But we're a long way from Europe, America, China, Russia agreeing to share each other's data.
But we can't wait for too long for that, though, either, because we're now moving all those applications that Sir Douglas mentioned about. It was all to do with smartphones. And we're moving from smartphones now to connected devices, massive growth in connected devices. And not only that, the timeliness of the use of the data is becoming important, the low latency of it all. And therefore, the establishment of these data centers and the ability to do this needs to be created much quicker than we all think about. A good example, we've been studying where we can work in this area in Hong Kong. And I don't want to start getting into 5G at the moment, but just as an example of the application, because no one's mentioned the word 5G yet, but connected cars and assisted driving, right? We've done studies on the accidents in Hong Kong. People going through traffic lights on red, going around corners at night and running into roadworks or other parked vehicles. If we can reduce the accidents on those roads by 50%, those preventable accidents that connected car assisted driving can do, we can reduce the need for 2 hospitals in Hong Kong. That's how many accidents we have in our statistics. And that's where I think and that requires very low latency activity between the car, the driver, and the various sensors around the roads and traffic lights and things. So I think that's a very good example of where it can make a big impact.
Minister Ibrahim?
Yeah, I think also we have to look at the pricing. Digital infrastructure and the use of digital infrastructure becomes attractive when the customer feels that the price is competitive. Now, in our part of the world, especially in our country, because we are a small country with less number of people, the price of fiber internet connection is very high when compared to the other countries. Just last week, one of our telecommunications company, they announced a 1 GB connection, which is around $600 per month, when in other countries it is around $50 to $100. So it is also the pricing. being a small country, we have fishermen, agriculture, farmers, and other people. But we also have the payment systems, mobile payments, apps. All these also help us to increase connectivity and also to increase our GDP. But also we have to be mindful of the pricing, because if the prices are very high, then for the customers it is not very attractive and people don't want to use it. So if you don't have the customers for that, then you don't have the appetite for that.
I'll pick up on pricing just slightly later. I want to bring in Joachim. I mean, you know, there's a sense out there that MDBs are reluctant to disburse loans for projects, infrastructure projects, which are less than $30 million. They go more with $100 million and above. I mean, is there a ballpark figure there? Is there a thinking behind that, or?
No, I think there's sort of a overcome conceived wisdom that private sector is taking care of ICT, is taking care of digital infrastructure investment. I think it's a false wisdom, but I think it's quite widely spread among the MDB community. Now, we as a newcomer, I think, want to take a fresh look and want to look at this differently, because we see that digital infrastructure actually is not that different, has policy elements, that there is a big financing gap. So we see sort of two big areas we explore for our investments. One is really the basic core infrastructure, the backbone networks, satellites, shared infrastructure, shared towers. That's one area which is like traditional infrastructure, has similar regulatory challenges, and we want to be there because that's what we see as our core business. But then other infrastructure sectors are really changing as a result of technology and availability of big data. And if I look at energy, for example, the ability of smart grids to absorb renewable energies, we're talking a lot about climate change here. If we want power grids to absorb more renewable energy, we need very different grids. We need net metering, we need a lot of capacity of the power sector to modernize, build infrastructure of tomorrow. Sir Flynn already talked about smart cities. I mean, transport grids of tomorrow, the transport in cities tomorrow could look entirely different. The space use of cities would be very different in autonomously driven vehicles, where less space is allocated to roads and parking. So we want to help our members think ahead and ask what kind of investments make sense today to prepare members, in a sense, to leapfrog. Because those countries that are today urbanizing have the chance to invest in the power systems into the urban systems of tomorrow and don't have to go the sort of long, arduous path and the detours that would follow what already urbanized countries have gone through. So that's where we hope to be.
Minister Hansen, perhaps you can weigh in here, because I mean, you talked earlier about how Luxembourg is ahead of the curve. It's a front runner in terms of digital technology advancement. I mean, what are some of the lessons learned that would be useful for the other countries?
I think there was one point now mentioned where we should work, where a country which has a quite high standard now as Luxembourg, we have to discuss about the next investment in infrastructure. We have to take the motto of the AIIB, which is lean, clean, green. So talking about new innovative systems, we have problems with energy and water supply with all the classic infrastructures. So we have now to invest in innovation programs, in research programs to develop and to design the next infrastructure. I think there will be the next heavy investments coming towards the governments who had already had decisions some decades ago. That's the next step where we should go, and there will be a new and heavy investments coming towards us.
I want to right now highlight the issue that Minister Ibrahim brought up earlier about cost. Paul, perhaps you can address it. I mean, it's so expensive. I mean, if you take a look at what 5G entails, I mean, it's enough for you to go like, maybe it can wait.
Well, I mean, 5G is an evolution of mobile networks, but it goes beyond mobile networks. It's not just for smartphones. If you wanted a faster smartphone, we can do that in 4G. It's the ability to have low latency connectivity to lots of devices, thousands, billions of devices. And I think that's what we have to look at. And it gives us the ability in the urban areas, the dense connectivity, the hyperconnectivity that we want to achieve for that type of thing. But at the same time, depending on the spectrum that you're using, you can be looking at using it in the rural areas and in the wider areas to solve some of these cost problems. Now, what I've seen on the work I've been doing in South Africa and in New Zealand, where you have these larger suburban and rural areas, laying fiber to a street is quite easy. You dig and build, it's not too bad. But what really causes delay and cost is the fanning out to each home on an individual basis, digging the last 50 meters. Now, we've never really been able to do fixed wireless access from those streets to the homes to bypass that dig and build process until now, because with 5G we can actually get to what you might call near fiber-like speeds. And therefore, if you can build to the street and then put up a tower and use that tower to reach all of the buildings by putting a small device on each building, then you're cutting out a lot of time and a lot of cost and bringing down the cost from where it could cost you anywhere from $500 to $1,000 a connection with fiber to maybe $100 or $200 using it with a combination or a hybrid of fiber to a local point of connection and then wireless in the area. The other benefit, of course, is that because it's wireless, it removes a lot of the uncertainty about when you build to a building. If you don't get that customer to sign up, then you've built for nothing. Where if you put it in the area with wireless, you have a much higher degree of flexibility, and therefore that also can bring your costs down.
The auction fees, is there anything governments can do?
Oh, they drive you nuts, don't they? When you look at Germany and Italy for the last rounds of auctions, 6 billion euros for the... Where's the money left to build the infrastructure, all right? I think that governments should look at a new approach. Instead of trying to double tax the operators, think about a way of how we can together build these networks. If you go look at how we build fiber, we can dig roads and build as much fiber as we like, and the only tax that we pay on this is a domestic rate. We pay a percentage of our revenues to the government. Why can't the governments think of doing the same thing with spectrum? Say, we want to give these operators the spectrum that the consumers need for the types of services that they want. We'll clear spectrum, we'll move it around, we'll make it available, and then use a domestic rate as a means of recompense for the use of the spectrum. I think that's a much better approach that we should be looking at now and doing the same as we always did with the infrastructure in the ground, because you can't have, really, I don't think you can have true infrastructure competition where you have limited national natural resources, and digging holes in the ground and spectrum in the air are all national resources that need to be managed better.
Minister Hansen, is that a viable proposition?
Oh, I won't enter this discussion. I think this will lead us very far from where we should perhaps discuss. It is a very specific topic. I just want to say something. We are now, it's normal, we are in a discussion here about digital connectivity, about how we can, we just have to focus also sometimes, why are we doing all this? And this is sometimes forgotten a little bit. We are here in a surrounding of experts, specialists. We have always, and I'm a minister for digitalization, it's perhaps a little bit unused that you hear it from me. We have to talk about for who are we doing all this. We never, sometimes I have the impression we forget in the more technical discussions why we are talking about digital connectivity. So that 100% of the people are connected, if that is the only goal, that we can say afterwards, wow, there are 100% of the people are connected. I think that's the wrong goal. We have sometimes to ask ourselves, and you mentioned it by the people signing always a check in the US. We have to talk about digital inclusion. Why are we doing this? And if there are people who prefer perhaps to sign, or because they don't know why they do it, or to like it, we have to talk about skills, about education, about investing also in programs to get everyone in this digital boat, instead of losing us perhaps in the discussion of getting the whole digital connectivity. So that is also very, very important. The digitalization or the connectivity is just the way to reach the goal, and it has to be a human-centered approach. And sometimes we lose this in our discussions, and governments, perhaps it's a little bit different if I see the different experts on other issues here. A government has always to have this in their strategy, to have everyone, and not only some specialists or tech freaks or a special class of people involved in this process. So the digital inclusion and always the questions why we are doing all this should sometimes be in the center of all our discussions, also in these discussions why we are investing, where we are investing, and what is the most important.
So Douglas, how should a digital strategy look like for a country?
I think you have to start off with what your objectives are. I mean, I think that one of this personal view, I mean, I think that one of the reflections that may well be made over the last decade is that at a time of extraordinary low interest rates, governments in major countries didn't take the opportunity to say, we're just going to go and build this and we're going to capture it back through a revenue share from what's done, because there's enough evidence in the world today that countries that have invested in the digital backbone, who have invested in training of people to exploit the digital backbone, have created more GDP than they would otherwise have done, and faster than countries that haven't invested. And I think leaving the more complicated areas of the country to the private sector is difficult. You can incent, you can cajole, but I do think that sometimes public policy has to step up and make that investment, and you know, as a way of enabling a broader social cohesion by bringing employment and job and connectivity to parts of the country that are left behind because industries that they had been expert in have ceased to be so relevant. But I do think it starts off even a stage before that. You do need to have a proper debate in the country as to what role do you want the digital economy to play, because it has an impact on everything else. You do have to have a policy around how you're going to tax it. You do have to have a policy around data privacy and cyber security, and these are all governmental responsibilities. Otherwise, you end up with potentially the value ending up in either a very small group of companies or individuals, or in a different part of the world, which is difficult to explain why you would have enabled that to happen. And those broader debates, which lead you back into what I said earlier about you then need some kind of cooperation so that there is something of a level playing field in localization, data privacy, the taxation of the digital economy. And you can see that today, the approaches that are being thought about in the UK and France, the reaction to those approaches from the US is, clearly a debate that it would have been better to have at the beginning rather than as a response to where we've ended up.
Peter, your thoughts on how a digital strategy should look like?
Horses for courses. I mean, it really ends up depending, back to you said, what is the driver within each country? And I don't think there's a blanket that fits every country in terms of what that digital strategy looks like. As we talked about earlier, the difference between the Maldives and Hong Kong, are obviously profound in terms of what the underlying drivers are, what the priorities are for governments and for citizens. But generally speaking, I would just say, as a rule of thumb, there's certainly not a lack of interest in private sector investment that would want to go into increasing that digital rollout regardless of which strategy, or not necessarily which strategy, but which kind of level of maturity that individual markets are at. Certainly we see that from our investors and from ourselves, that there's profound interest in investing in the underlying infrastructure that's there, not always necessarily the end use and the sort of competitive marketing use, but the infrastructure needed for this. There's certainly a lot of investment appetite.
I'll pick up on the engaging of the private sector, but before that, Joachim, I mean, given all the uncertainties in the world today, where growth is easing and trade tensions and PMIs are falling, do you think there's a risk that there'll be even less money going into digital infrastructure or infrastructure as a whole?
Well, despite all the talk about private investment in infrastructure that's gone on for years, unleashing the trillions, the actual data shows that infrastructure going into developing country infrastructure is going down. So we have not tackled that issue for infrastructure in general, let alone for new sectors like digital infrastructure. So I think there's a huge task ahead. And we as multilaterals can play a role. Less so with our balance sheets. I think with our balance sheets we can do something, and we should do something, but it is really the broader role of multilaterals, of helping prepare projects, working with governments on their strategies, helping provide political risk cover for private investors. I think that's where we have to be smart, and that holds for traditional infrastructure, and there's vast experience on that, but quite a bit of those experience are actually relevant for digital infrastructure. That's where we see sort of a little bit our niche. Because just as others have said, it is not about connectivity itself, it's about achieving the benefits for people from connectivity. We've talked about access to finance, we've talked about access to commerce, we've not talked about health. If I think of many of our member countries with terrible health indicators, the chance to leapfrog health service provision to a much more effective way of giving access to broad swaths of the population to affordable health care through digital infrastructure, I think is a huge potential, just to throw one more really exciting dimension on the table.
Yeah, and I would just echo that. I think I largely come out of the energy industry over the last 20 years, and you certainly saw that with development banks, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, elsewhere, where multilateral banks are able to come in, provide that kind of de-risking, allowing the sort of unleashing of an awful lot of private capital, and then giving actually much more competitive pricing to the markets, because people can come in, have reverse auctions, you know, at least on the energy side, and we certainly saw the role that multilateral banks can have, and certainly AIIB could play that role.
Yes, I think we cannot go backwards. We move from the primary industries to manufacturing and the tertiary industries. Now the way forward is the digital economy. So every country, whether it is a big or small country, we cannot substitute investments for digital infrastructure with other infrastructure. But we have to think about differentiate between small and big countries. For small countries, multilateral MDBs and also other banks cannot look at the profitability of the project, but it should be looked as giving a service to the citizens. When we first introduced fixed landlines in the Maldives, it was cable and wireless which came into the Maldives in 1970s. If we waited for the government public policy sector to invest in that, then it would be very difficult. And we gave cable and wireless 25 years license to do business in the Maldives. And now we have Ooredoo as a competitor in the Maldives. So when we brought in Ooredoo, we saw market decline in the prices. And so everybody got more connected to the digital infrastructure. And I think when we talk about the digital policy going forward, now we are working on the National Development Plan, but I think today, at this day and age, we have to look at broadband as a public good. It cannot be rivalrous, and it cannot be exclusive to some people. It should be seen as a public good. Then only everyone can actually get benefits of the digital infrastructure. Talked about e-health. Being a country with a big ocean state, I always like to say that Maldives is not a small island nation, but Maldives is a big ocean state with many, many islands. If we are to have health centers in each of these islands with physicians, anesthetists and everybody in the health centers, it will be very costly for us. But if it is connected, all these health centers, hospitals, tertiary hospitals, they are connected through the digital infrastructure, then the cost of giving that service is very low. But when we are limited in the sense we cannot do that because the investments we need for that is very huge, but the market is very small. When we look at the Maldives, we only have 2 fiber cables connected, undersea fiber cables connected to the outside world. That is done by the Cable and Wireless and the Ooredoo. So they have the monopoly over the fiber cable. But in the new government, we are exploring opportunities where we can actually invest ourselves. The government can invest ourselves to have a fiber cable through Singapore or Mauritius, and that we can actually sell I am not an expert on that, but sell that broadband space so that the prices of that goes down and people are more, people have more appetite to be connected, and so that again the economy grows. So I think that's the way forward.
Earlier we talked about how we need to engage the public sector more. I mean, from the government perspective, Minister Ibrahim and Minister Hansen, I mean, what are you looking from the private sector so that there'll be better cooperation and partnership?
I think that is one of the main goals that the government has to address, how to connect different stakeholders. And there I can perhaps also talk about the Luxembourgish model. Luxembourg is a small country. It's quite easy to see each other, and we had through all the years, even if we were not discussing about digital infrastructure, we had the tripartite system. So we have meetings between the different stakeholders, the public sector, the private sectors, the representatives of the civil society. We have committees where we meet each other when we have problems or crises. Also the new ministry now of digitalization, which was created 6 months ago, we will now create also a high committee for the digital transformation. It's quite easy there to meet the private sector. It's quite easy to have also a meeting with a government member and to discuss the different topics. Also to discuss the topics and the fears that people have perhaps with topics about employment, about other topics coming with the digitalization. So when there we create platforms to meet each other, to involve each other, to have pilot projects, to discuss them, to see what is good, what is bad, and to improve, in fact, ourselves, because we have this quite a good contact between the different actors. I think this is a way to work in a country which is easier in a small country like Luxembourg, and we have it's quite small and easy to discuss. But that was always in this context always a competitive advantage of Luxembourg, that we can have these platforms. You meet each other and we can discuss in these platforms what we can do each for to continue where the investment should go, where different projects should go, and I think that is a good model for a small country.
Minister?
Yeah. Actually, I would also like to highlight that through the digital infrastructure, we also, when you look at the middle-income countries, developing countries, the epidemic of corruption is also very much there. When I just want to highlight that investing on digital infrastructure and doing businesses through the digital infrastructure reduces corruption also. What we, the Minister of Finance, what we are doing is now we have a portal where all the national tenders will take place through the portal, internet portal, so that everyone will have access to, everyone knows everything and the documents are there. So there is no papers involved in that. So that's where we want to go. So that is also one aspect of it. So reducing corruption and bringing everyone to the to be connected to the digital infrastructure.
So some of the benefits of digital infrastructure for the private sector. So Douglas, your views on how there can be better engagement between the two?
Yeah. Sorry.
It's okay. So Douglas, you can go first. After that, Paul, go ahead.
Okay. You know, I think that there's a tremendous partnership opportunity, because I think the lessons from the private sector on infrastructure development is that take broadband as the best example, or mobile phones. I mean, the operators built the backbone, but it was the app developers that monetized it in hundreds of thousands of ways that no one had ever thought about before. So by creating the infrastructure, by making it open architecture, by saying, here's something to build a service on, to distribute a product through, what can you do? I think the same partnership, public-private, is also the same. I think health is by far the best example in terms of giving governments an extraordinary way to reduce cost by having much more data about the citizens and being able to monitor when and how to provide services. And the great example that Paul gave about, you know, as we get a demographically aging population, helping people to drive more safely by not letting them drive is probably a pretty good thing. And so, I mean, I think that the public side should be about enabling the private side to come up with the products and the services that the public would enjoy. The public side giving security that credentials and data is protected, and giving licenses to the app providers as to how they can use data and how they interact with the end consumer. I mean, that's a model that it will be innovative. The governments can never be innovative, but they can provide the background, the credibility, the protection, and the necessary, not the over-necessary, the necessary regulation to make that ecosystem work.
Yet a lot of, I mean, the private sector decides to go it alone, Paul. Why would that be?
Because it can. You know, I think because it can. I mean, I think that again, as people look back and see the dominance that's been created by winner-takes-all approaches, which is almost inevitable, whichever service or platform provider gets the most subscribers will be dominant and will kill its rivals. And we've seen that in America, we've seen it in China, we've seen it all over the world. Now, as a model, is that efficient for consumers? It may be, but it may also beg questions as to whether there needs to be some oversight, and then you say from where, because you've now got 2-3 billion consumers around the world using your platform. I mean, in my old world of banking, you know, I've heard many regulators say, you know, Ant Financial was too small to worry about, and now that it's got 700 million customers, it's kind of too big to worry about. You know, it's a very different proposition. So again, it comes back to thinking ahead of the service being delivered. But you know, the one other thing, you know, I think is really important for public-private, the demographic aging challenge around the world, in the West and in Asia. You know, the ability to keep people in their homes, not a burden on their families, not a burden on the state, because they will need support from time to time. So much technology is available to monitor in a proper way people's activities and their health statistics and so on, their heartbeat, etc. That people can have a life that they find much more attractive, because they're being monitored in a supportive way, with first responders able to come to them. Otherwise, they would be in some kind of care facility with people wandering around saying, are you still alive, and standing up and okay. So lots of opportunity.
Paul?
Well, I think Sir Douglas is spot on there, but I think that we as a private operator have to start and think differently, and we have to think of partnerships. We have to. To give you an example, as we move into the 5G hyper-connected environment, just as estimates, right? These are not actual figures, but we'll go from 3,000 base stations in Hong Kong for our network to 30,000 base stations, right? Which begs the question, should they be shared networks? I mean, should we really be having our own single network and everybody else building their own separate network? So you've got many, many base stations. That's a big question. Secondly, we'll go from 4 million smartphones to 40 million or more devices being connected. But one thing that gets overlooked is we'll go from $200 Hong Kong dollars ARPU every month for the smartphone to maybe less than 2 per device And if there has to be any form of human intervention in managing that, we're dead. It's got to be zero touch, it's got to be completely automated. So then we look at how these are going to be used, and I think we have to look at industry vertical solutions, to Sir Douglas's point, whether it's healthcare, whether it's connected cars, whether it's security, all of these things. The connectivity portion will be a 1x. I think there's probably a 7x in terms of the data management, the data analytics, the workflow management around it, the whole industry-specific solution that can be put together by an industry-specific solution provider. Now, that might be the government. It might be existing private partners like security companies, whatever. Or there might be new areas where we want to play that no one's playing in yet. And this is where I think we have to change our views and say, you know, which sandpits do we want to play in? And what type of businesses do we want to be in? Who should we partner with? Where should we play ourselves? Where should we partner with government? And I think that's going to be a big, brave new world for us private telecoms operators.
Perhaps illustrating also where such a private-public partnership could work also in our country, which concerning connected cars. We have now, between Luxembourg, Germany, France, we have now started a program to test connected cars with the private industry, because you have cross-border problems, different traffic regulations, different speed regulations, different roads. So we created now Luxembourg as a test bed, because we have all these countries around where the connected cars with the private industry, we can check what happens if a connected car goes from Germany to Luxembourg, because there are changes. And this is quite a good opportunity, if you say, so governments are not innovative or cannot be innovative. I think we are innovative in the way that we created this test bed between 4 governments. I think that is quite important, and there we work really good together. It's also 5G and everything you want to have in this project, and there you can afterwards share this experience with the private sector and continue to have a cross-border solution in sharing big data in all the problems linked to this situation.
One of the things that one of the examples that's given in China's Belt and Road project that I think is quite illustrative of what you've just said is that the train that goes from Western China to Europe, which is a single journey, there's not a single piece of physical infrastructure that was built to make that happen. But the interoperability of customs procedures, documentation, all the things that enabled the train to travel through as many, 40-odd countries, was done to make it possible. And in a way, that is a great example of how governments are going to have to work together to create a much broader trade and investment market by getting seamless transfer of goods, data, people through economies where governments choose to participate.
I was just going to add to Luxembourg being a great place to do this cross-border experimentation, because with 5G, there are technical issues as well to do with cross-border spectrum. Spectrum doesn't stop at the border, it carries on over the other side of the border. And with 5G, there's a lot of options as to how you deploy that spectrum. And if it's deployed differently in different countries and there's an overlap, you will get interference between them, and it can prevent them from operating. So I think it would be good to see how that becomes trialed and managed in a place that has so many countries around it.
No, I just want to come in on this point of cross-country cooperation on connectivity, which I think we have touched on several dimensions here. There are big public policy challenges, whether it's taxation, regulation, security, data privacy, and they will need new international cooperation arrangements. Some of those can be handled by existing institutions. Some of those are more informal learning from each other, and multilateral institutions can help with that. But some will need new institutional arrangements, new agreements across borders. And they will need different formats. They will need to be responsive to the fast pace of change. Because I think this is an area where traditional regulation always tends to lag behind the technology frontier and can be quite counterproductive, if not handled with a lot of private sector input. We as AIB are not a standard setter, so we're not the the organization that would handle such responsibility. But I think our creation, the fact that in this day and age where there are lots of international tensions, you can create new multilateral cooperation mechanisms where different countries take the lead, where in the end, in our case, 100 countries come together. I think that is encouraging. It shows that if there's a new challenge, there are ways of finding new multilateral cooperation mechanisms to handle these challenges. And it's maybe another case where this may be necessary to find new ways of working together in a multilateral setting.
Peter?
I would just tend to agree on that point, that I think if you look, whether it's talking about just connectivity or a host of other technologies, you mentioned smart grids and cross borders, autonomous or connected vehicles have been brought up before. There's going to be a need for ever greater cooperation, I think, between governments. The idea that you can do these in an island when you have cross-border transactions or physical movements of things enabled by technology, invariably there's going to be that cooperation. And the telecommunications sector has a pretty long experience with that, certainly within Europe and elsewhere.
Earlier we talked about how we want it to be inclusive. The question really is, how can you be inclusive if digital literacy is still very low in a lot of the countries? How do you address that? And where are we falling short?
Well, I mean, I'm going to give you a personal example. I've been working with an NGO down in South Africa called the Click Foundation, and it's been putting broadband into schools and putting learning management systems into schools, and I think we need more of that. I think once we have the infrastructure, the digital connectivity, then we can start to use the digital connectivity to start and teach people at an earlier age, and they don't need to worry, don't need to go to school. They can work at home eventually, so it can be done remotely. I think a lot has to be invested in education.
Yeah, I think this is quite one of the most important points of discussion. You have to implement programs, education programs, skilling programs, reskilling programs. We have, for instance, a digital skills bridge. This is the name of the program, where people, where in an industry, in a company, they change to the digitalization. If jobs could be in danger, we have a digital skills bridge with a financial support of the government for reskilling the people, and we have to implement also educational programs for people not being in an education system, for elder people, for everyone who is really not involved in the program, to help them. And they have to be really focused on the program of that person. An elder people of 19 perhaps is not really the person to learn the last tricks on Instagram, okay, but she can have an idea how to use the banking or in the e-health system, to have the right opportunity to use the digital devices to help or to address the topic which is important for her. So this is really important, to have programs and to invest really in education, skilling, reskilling programs. That is one of the very important issues.
And you can bring in innovative new tools as well. I think with virtual reality and augmented reality, you really are able to help people from a distance. I was looking at one the other day where it allows a call center to see what the person is seeing with his phone and actually show images. Put the cable in this socket, or put the cable in that socket, press this button, and it can really help. And I think tools like that will help people to be more skillful without actually having to go through the initial learning.
How big a problem is it for the Maldives?
I think it is a problem because given a phone and internet connection is not what we are talking about. We are talking about giving skills, giving education so that they can go and make apps for themselves. We need coders, people who can code. We see that we are talking about a 10% 10% investment in infrastructure leads to a 2.8% increase in GDP. But that does not mean we just give an internet connection and phone increases our GDP. We need people who can actually make apps, make life easier for other people. Like, let's say, for example, in India, Bangalore, and in US, Silicon Valley, people make apps, which is, they make companies, they sell these companies. So for small, medium developing countries, it's the population, the citizen is connected to internet, the digital infrastructure is there, but the digital literacy rate is very low. So I think multilateral development banks can also help in educating people in those countries, not only investing in digital infrastructure, but also helping us educate our people, so that not only we have accountants, lawyers, maybe economists, but also we have people who can code, come up with apps, so that can also help in the digital economy, and it also stimulates our economic growth. I don't think just giving a phone and internet connection is what we are talking about.
Well, I'd say that everybody always thinks start with schools, which makes sense, and start with young people because they end up being the future coders and lawyers and doctors. But we're certainly in a generation now in much of the world where you're effectively being born digital, right? So people are growing up around digital technology. The inherent familiarity with it is much greater. I do think there's a challenge for people who are sort of past that generation, right? Who are out of school, who are out of, you know, the primary or secondary or even tertiary education. Really, who are the small, medium enterprise owners or the people working in a business to say, how can I reskill? How can I move on to a different career? Or I run a small business. How can I make use of these tools? I don't understand apps. I don't understand what's available to me, whether you're a plumber or you're an artist or you're an accountant. You know, what is it that all these digital suites of technologies can do? So there certainly is some scope, I think, for the ability to get training into the hands of people who are already in the workforce who might look to catalyze something else.
Joachim, do you see the AIIB playing that role as suggested by Minister?
This is another area, labor, education, where actually dynamic developing countries can leapfrog and may face less transition problem than mature advanced economies. In more aged, mature economies, you have much more entrenched systems of long-term employment, expectations of long-term employment, more old people who may have a harder time adjusting. In emerging, quite young societies, you have many more young people. You then have to support that through an education system that is from the beginning set for lifetime learning, where people are not expecting to be in a job for their entire career. So I do think the governments need to help on the education side, help build the right education system. And again, their technology can be a help just like in the health system. So I do think there's a lot of hope and a lot of perspective for developing countries that have the dynamism and have the young people to, I think, suffer less from these transition challenges.
I was going to say, I think one of the other areas of education that's hugely important is giving the consumer a good understanding of how his data is protected and what risks are being run by being connected. I mean, if you read some of the alarmist stories around 5G that your fridge is going to spy on you, you know, it's absurd. I mean, we've all learned that we don't call our children Alexa because they would get kind of busy, but getting people to understand about privacy, cyber protection, and the recourse that they will have with government support should things go wrong, I think is hugely important. Otherwise, it'll only take one incident or 2 or 3 incidents across the world, and people will be nervous and will withdraw from you know, the digital economy that is there hugely beneficially to support them.
One thing which is important perhaps, and I can always talk about Luxembourg, I'm a part of being the Minister Delegate for Digitalization. I'm the Minister in charge of the civil service, having around in Luxembourg 30,000 civil servants, and we have, let's say we have a school for the initial training for the civil servants, and also the lifelong training of the civil servants. And that is also an important key in major countries, that you have to give to these civil servants this digital awareness. So, and not only learning them the digital tools, but also how they can treat with companies being a front runner in the digital world, so that they also have in elaborating, in doing the policy, the other policy makers, so to give them this awareness and how to be prepared to be fit to be a part of this digital world. And I think this is also for European countries, for Luxembourg, for instance, it is quite important because they come perhaps into the civil service 20, 25 years ago. They are perhaps nowadays not aware of where the new solutions will go and what the new problems are, and this is for us, for instance, really important to have special programs for the civil servants, also to be ready for private partnerships, for the problems and the topics, the issues that we have to address. So this is also a quite interesting way of addressing the digital transformation.
I'll open the discussion to the floor after this final question. Paul, what's needed for this paradigm shift?
Yeah, I think so. I think we have to think about this whole new world that's coming to us, and we all have to change. Private operators have to change. I think governments have to change. I think the point about education for the government is a brilliant one. We always see around the world regulators for telecoms are always so far behind the ball because they don't keep up the same as technology is moving, and it needs to happen that they become current with everything that's happening. So yeah, I think change is coming, and we all have to change, and we all have to. I would hope that the AIIB has the influence to be able to do some of this, to help to create the partnerships, to help to create some of the new perspectives of how we should be approaching digital connectivity.
We're happy to take questions. If you could raise your hand and introduce yourself. Is there anyone with any question? Please, sir, somewhere in the middle over there. If we have a microphone.
My name is srie8pyz0H. I'm chairman of the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation in Switzerland, created by the G20. And the purpose of the foundation is to create connectivity of legal entities around the world. That means currently we already have 1.4 million legal entities in our database. The data are for free. And we are striving to go to 40, 50 million for the supply chain, capital market, digital economy. Has the panel any view on how to include the lay in your programs?
How do you include, could you repeat that question?
How to include that standard in your programs. So in your business processes, in your business to government processes, etc.
I know there's a lot of work going on in terms of the use of blockchain in the legal profession. I don't know whether that's a contributing factor, but beyond that, I don't know.
So Douglas, any input?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the projects that's underway is which needs massive global cooperation is legal identifiers, and I think that in a world of digital, for the protection of society, you need unique digital identity and you need transparency of non-human bodies, i.e. who the beneficial owners are of companies and trusts and so on. And then you need to, I think, to entrust qualifying bodies to hold those credentials and be authorized with permissions to share those credentials where people ask them to. And I think that's a huge, huge service that needs to be sort of organized on an international basis so that people don't, I mean, if you think today, some services work great, some are terrible, that, you know, what's your name, what's your address, how long have you lived there, I mean, how many times do you need to fill that out, as opposed to there ought to be somewhere where you just sort of link it and everything gets filled in. So the kind of service that you're describing, I think, is crucial to a digital world, and there should be authorized holders of that data. But ultimately, governments have got to get over have got to think about whether they require everybody to have a digital identifier to protect them. I mean, in the world I came from before I was doing what I'm doing just now, banking, one of the things that helped actually get people to provide more data was the fact that they were nervous about their identity being taken. So where in the past people could be nervous about saying, why do you need to know any more about me? The answer is we need to know about you so that when somebody pretends to be you, we can know that's not the kind of thing or the place you would be. So for people's protection, a digital identity is not an intrusion, it's a protection. We need to get that across, and we need to use the kind of organization, I think, that you've described to protect people and to hold secure that data.
Absolutely right. Digital identity is a key element of all the different things that are going on at the moment. And I think rather than having the central body, the use of blockchain and distributed ledger as a means of holding that for everyone to use is coming along quite well, I think. There's a lot of people working on digital identity like that.
Life has only to do with legal entities based on the mandate of the G20. We are not empowered to do anything about natural persons.
We need both.
Is there another question? At the back, please. We'll take a question from the front later on, but the gentleman behind, I'm sorry, it's being blocked by the plants for me up front.
My name is Adiwoso. I'm from Indonesia. I run a satellite company for Indonesia. We just won a PPP project for a very large satellite, which dictated by the government to provide 98,000 schools, 43,000 village administration, and about 10,000 health connectivity. We have been doing this for the last 45 years in Indonesia, and we come to a certain situation where we call connectivity. We don't talk about beyond connectivity yet. I think these gentlemen here are talking about beyond connectivity. We're still struggling to get the connectivity for everyone. Without providing the last 35 million people with internet connectivity, we will be having a strain in our growth due to the fact that the head of the train is going to a very fast speed, but the 35 million is going to a very, very slow train. It will engage itself at one time. So it's mandatory that the government or any institution has to think to bring this 35 million, the last of the 10% or 15% of the people to be connected. Secondly, we are encountering massive problems of what I call it off-grid electricity. In these villages, electricity is not provided 24 hours. So the second infrastructures we looked at is how do we find a way to provide off-grid. With connectivity off-grid, then we can empower the SME. So the money is coming from the big cities to the villages rather than around. So we're working with the IAB, trying to find a solution to this. But I would like to just tell you that from our country, we're already 17th economy in the world. We're still struggling with the basic connectivity.
But making good progress, Bart. Thank you so much for that. I think there was a question somewhere up front. Yes, please.
Samuel Tamba Musa, Ambassador of Sierra Leone, accredited to the Benelux countries and the EU. My question actually relates to the infrastructure in the developing countries. For my country, we have set up a Directorate of Science, Technology, and Innovations in the Office of the President. I do see that over here in Luxembourg, they have a whole ministry of digitalization. So first of all, I'm interested in the value addition in terms of that move. Secondly, there's the issue of infrastructure, but there is also the very important issue of capacity to manage the infrastructure. How much of that is taken into consideration when they are funding or providing support for digital infrastructure? Thank you.
Minister?
Yeah, so you're asking about the added value of the new ministry. I can tell you that in 3 or 4 years from now. We created this new ministry 6 months ago when the new government took office, so on the 5th of December. We had till now different ministries responsible for digitalization in their domain. So and nowadays also there are also other ministries who are preparing the digitalization. So the Minister for Education, he works also for the digitalization for the educational system. But till now we had no minister in the government when there were problems between administrations, public bodies, to resolve this problem and to discuss it in the government itself. And we have 2 ministers who are heading this new ministry. It's the Prime Minister himself, who is the Minister for Digitalization, and it's myself. This is really also a symbolic part to push the digital problems in the government, not only to leave them to the civil servants, but to have also the political choice and the political power of pushing to solve and to resolve if there are problems concerning the different topics. That is in fact the new moment, the added value, that we put it now on the level of the government, and we have 2 ministers who are also responsible for other domains, me being for civil service, which is really important, so it's not innocent that we put these 2 ministers in the lead. And the Prime Minister himself, who was here also this morning for also the promotion of the ICT sector in the world, for having also the contacts and to push it on a European and on an international level. So I think this will be a great added value for having it and for having it on a political level, and not to leave it in the hands of the civil service. So that is in fact what we see in the creation of this new ministry. We act now also as a facilitator and a coordinator of the digitalization through to the government. We push the e-government, which is also one of our main missions, where we have, if you look all the international reports, the benchmarks, the DEISI index, we see also in Luxembourg that we have still problems, not problems, but we are ranked, I think, 70th in the index. So we have to push the e-government. So we have also developers, we have designers, we have people working in this domain to push the e-government, to facilitate every procedure for the companies and also for the citizens. But, and I said it already because it's one of the main goals also that we have on our agenda, the digital inclusion. We are not there also as a ministry for digitalization for the tech freaks. The tech freaks, they are normally really good in what they are doing, and we don't have as ministry to tell them what they have to do. We have to look that we have programs that every citizens can be a part of the digitalization. And that is one of the main goals also of a digitalization ministry, not only to do the technical part and to be everyone wants to be a part of the digitalization. What we have to make it possible that they can be a part of the digitalization. And that is also one of the main goals, apart the point of pushing really the digitalization in the government, in the public service, but also in cooperation with the private sector.
Can I add? Actually, I want to add to this that discussion. That is, we are also very similar to the Luxembourg experience in that with the change in the new government, which was sworn in 17th of November, we also have a new ministry, which is called Ministry of Science and Technology. So the purpose of that is, if you don't have those kind of ministries, or other agencies specifically for that, you don't get digitalization or ICT policies into the public policy making. That's the point. In previously, the National Center for Information Technology in the Maldives was under the Ministry of Finance. I don't understand why the National Center for Information Technology should be under the Ministry of Finance, because if then the Ministry of Finance will always neglect the National Center for Information Technology issues. But now when we have the separate Ministry for Science and Technology, we see that the minister is keep calling me every day. You have to include these in the new budget. I want to do this. So that kind of public policy discussion comes into the cabinet and everything. So I think that is very important that we give focus on this digital infrastructure, and there are separate agencies for this.
We can take one more question. This one over there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Christoph Antonder. I'm the managing director of an accounting firm here in Luxembourg. Thank you very much for your comments. It's very insightful. What I was thinking, once you have invested in infrastructure, you have invested in education, we see today that developed countries need to be open-minded as well towards developing countries, because once these developing countries have reached a certain level of education, of competitivity, borders should be open to allow free competitions from these developing countries. What pops to mind is, for instance, digital taxation. How does the panel see that developing countries will be open in the future towards the competition from the developing countries?
I was an accountant one day. I think the whole framework of taxation today is in need of updating. I mean, we've got an OECD model that was based on where a factory was located and physical flows of goods, and so much of the world today is digital. It kind of doesn't work. My own view is that ultimately could be a very long time, taxation will end up being based on where consumption is. It will be a revenue tax because it kind of works. Probably a combination of revenue, sales taxes and employment taxes. But I think it's one of the big hurdles to be overcome, because at the moment there is a massive amount of value in the industry, and if and where it's taxed is somewhat lacking in transparency and not entirely logical with where the value is being created in terms of consumption of the service. So you can see that there's an issue to be addressed, but the vested interests are enormous. The amount of money is enormous. So it will take global cooperation in the same way that as there has been on tax transparency and sharing of data, which nobody 10 years ago would have thought would have moved as fast as it has. And I hope, again, part of the digital agenda is to agree a framework, at least to start with a framework for considering how the digital economy should be taxed.
Just one final question.
Hi, thank you very much. I am from the Maldives. The biggest challenge we have for moving forward in our development is the isolation of the islands. 186 inhabited islands, with most of them with a population less than 500. It's impossible for us to have good healthcare, good education on each one of them. The question of economy of scale comes in. So the options we would be left with would be either to move them to one big island and then create an economy of scale. The other way is more practical to me now, is through connectivity. Now for that, I don't think people actually migrate just for jobs. A lot of people think people migrate for jobs only, to earn. People also migrate for better life. And for better life, what is essential is good healthcare, good education. if we can provide them good education and good healthcare on these smaller communities, a lot of us will not migrate and create one big, the capital of Maldives is not a place for people to live. It's too congested. The healthcare service, okay, the platform is there, the digital platform is there, but are the healthcare service, people in the healthcare, are they ready to use this? Education sector, are the teachers ready to do this? Are they prepared? Do they have the right, training for this?
So I'm sorry, is there a question?
Yes. Can we really have them made ready? Is it you or is it somebody else, who does that? Make them ready to use this. The banks have done it, but is the healthcare, education sector ready to do this? When can we do that?
Minister, would you like to take that question?
I don't think I have a good answer, but I do want to connect your question to the comment by the Indonesian colleague before, because I think Indonesia is a perfect example for what can be done. I think the vision that the Minister of Communication in Indonesia has laid out and then led to the kind of bidding that we've heard about, that is bringing connectivity to the remote islands, is a perfect example and exactly what we as a new bank like to support. Now, the similarity probably ends there, remote islands. I understand we are talking about a very different scale and I can judge about what of that might be applicable to the Maldives, but I think it's a good example for cross-country learning, and I just want to point out the Indonesian example as something that is, I think, quite exciting and shows public sector vision and then private sector initiative to respond.
It can be done. Peter, last words.
Yeah, and I was going to come back and relate that to Indonesia as well, both on the energy side. So I thought, the gentleman's comment was very interesting, and it relates to the fact that we can't look at connectivity and energy in isolation without each other when you're talking about really remote communities. So certainly the ability to produce microgrids economically is improving over time. And again, multilateral banks can certainly help in helping drive private capital there. And then the other question around are healthcare providers and or education providers ready to do this? There may be some in the room. It's certainly, I don't think any of us on this stage, but there are lots of companies out there that are starting to do tele-education or remote education, whether it's on the tutorial side or not. But there's certainly groups you could link up to if that's something you're interested in.
Joachim, Peter, Minister Ibrahim, Minister Hansen, Sir Douglas, Paul, I did pretty well. Thank you so much for your insights today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being part of the conversation.